Thank you, worship team, for just getting us all fired up and leading us so well. Josh, welcome home, man. Gosh. Oh, I was at the gym yesterday, and I was on the treadmill, and I was walking, and there's a row of treadmills in front of me. So I'm on this row, there's a row in front of me, and there's TVs on the wall. And I don't watch much of college football, and there was a game on, and I just noticed the score. And Georgia was beating another team like 40-7. And there's nobody on the treadmills in front of me, and there's this guy I see, and he's wearing a headband, and he's ready to go, and he walks up on the treadmill, and he's like standing at the edge of the treadmill, staring at the game. And it's 40-7. It's got to be at least the third quarter. And this dude is not running on the treadmill, he's running across all the empty treadmills, running across them, and then coming back, and then looking back at the TV. And I could tell he's a Georgia fan. He's going for Georgia. And I'm like, dude, you are way too fired up right now. They're winning 40-7. It's okay. And what happens is Georgia is about to let this other team score. So it's going to be 14-40. There's no chance. And that team scores, and this guy just starts doing this. Starts shaking his head. And I was like, dude, I hope you come to the Grove, because I want that kind of passion in our church. I want that kind of celebration in our church, right? And I'm thinking, man, we get fired up for football. Let's get fired up for the Lord, you know? So I just wanted to share that with you guys. And I was thinking about everything we've been learning. And you have to be honest with me because you're in church. So when you hear the words spiritual practice or spiritual disciplines, what comes to mind when you start to hear those words? And when I was in seminary, I took a class called Spiritual Formation, and I started learning about the spiritual practices and the spiritual disciplines. And you know what my thought was on these? I was like, man, this is a to-do list. Like, these are gonna make my life more mundane. This is boring, spiritual practices. And I started to think, if any of you think the same way that I used to, I wanna flip that right now. That's what I wanna do. So we can't look at these as a to-do list, right? Jesus calls us into a new way of life. And these are the things that he did. This is a better way. So what are some of the spiritual practices we've been learning about? Go ahead, shout them out. Prayer. You get a gold star, sir, wherever you are. Let's go. What are some more? Fasting. Huh? Meditation. Yep. Yes, okay, so you guys have been paying attention. Prayer, solitude, fasting, slowing. We've been going all over all these spiritual practices for some weeks now. And did you know that truth-telling and promise-keeping are spiritual practices? So hear me out. This is why these practices, this way of life is so important. Imagine if you knew that I was a liar and that I never told the truth. Could me and you have an intimate relationship? No. Why? Because you can't trust me. See, we don't tell the truth just because it's the right thing to do, right? This is a way of life that Jesus calls us to. Promise keeping. If I make a bunch of promises and never keep them with you, are you gonna think I'm a very reliable person? No. These are more than a to-do list. These are more than practices. This is a way of life that Jesus calls us to because it's what's best for us. And even thinking about his life, how he'd minister to crowds and he'd back off and he'd spend some time with the Father in solitude and prayer to recharge to go minister again. This is a way of life. And when I was asked to preach and I found out I was preaching on the practice of celebration, man, I feel like everybody else got robbed, to be honest. This is the best practice ever. Who doesn't enjoy celebrating, right? And so I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about how important the practice of celebration is. And Richard Foster has a quote that I loved, and I took that and I put it on the screen for you guys, and it says, celebration gives us the strength to live in all the other disciplines. When celebration is pursued, the other disciplines bring freedom from the things that have made our lives miserable for years. The practice of celebration, in my opinion, is one of the most important practices. And when I was thinking about living a life of celebration, God brought to my heart King David. Does anybody remember when the Ark of the Covenant was being brought back into Jerusalem? And it's okay if you don't. And David is just dancing with all of his might. He's just singing and dancing with everything he has. And he says, I will celebrate the Lord. That's 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 14. And I just thought of David and the way that he lived a life that was just sold out, celebrating the Lord. And I thought of that specific moment. And I was thinking, how after 3,000 years, you guys, this man's life is still celebrated and honored to this day. 3,000 years. When I was in Israel, I went to the Temple Institute. I'm learning all about the temple and the life of David. And I'm talking about David. I'm like, so David did this and David did that. And they said, oh, no. King David. I was like, whew, my bad, King David. I won't disrespect him. So much honor. 3,000 years later, he's to this day considered the greatest, most honored king to ever rule the people of Israel to this day. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to preach from his life. And I wanted to not just look at that moment in history where he's celebrating the Lord. What brought him up to that point? What are some things that he did in order to live a life of celebration? So I have this quote that it took me about 2 weeks to come up with, so you guys should write it down. Save you guys about 2 weeks. And this is what it says. In order to live a life of celebration, and this is why I say that. I mean, who likes practice, right? I don't want to practice celebration. I mean, I played football, and the only people who liked practice were kickers and quarterbacks. That's it. Jay Feely probably loved practice. So, I mean, I don't like practice. Let's play the game. In order to live a life of celebration, we must live a life worth celebrating. It's pretty good. It's pretty good, right? Not just because I came up with that. I'll say it again. In order to live a life of celebration, we must live a life worth celebrating. And you guys, you feel free to clap this service. That's okay. I don't care if you're the only one clapping, all right? I love the energy. So I'm thinking about King David's life, and I'm thinking about how he lived a life of celebration because he lived a life that was worth celebrating. And sure, he made some very big mistakes, but the overall theme of his life was the way that he celebrated and loved the Lord. So this brought me back to 1 Samuel chapter 16. If you guys have your Bibles, please turn there with me. 1 Samuel chapter 16. And this really brought me back to where it all started for David. And just to set the stage, in 1 Samuel, Israel is coming out of an era where they were appointing people as judges to rule over them. And they saw other nations that had kings, and they said Samuel was the priest at this time. Strong, powerful man named Samuel. He was God's chosen one. And they told Samuel, give us a king. We want to be like all the other nations. And God said, okay, you've turned your back on your one true king. I'll give you over to your passions and your desires, and I'll give you what you ask for. I'll give you a king. So Samuel anoints the first king of Israel, and his name is Saul. So we're not focusing too much on the life of Saul, but I want to give us some background. Saul is a man who chose to pursue power and status his entire life. And when we choose to pursue power and status, we end up living in fear our entire life. And that's exactly what happened to Saul. He feared men, he did not fear God. He made decisions based solely off of himself, not those that he was entrusted to lead and to serve. So he disobeyed the Lord, and God took his spirit and his anointing from Saul. And he told Samuel, he said, hey, get up, we're gonna go find another king to anoint. And so Samuel is on a mission to find another king. And this leads him to the house of Jesse. So 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 10 is where we're gonna pick up at. Jesse is David's father. So it says, Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? They're still the youngest, Jesse said. He's tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We won't sit down until he arrives. So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health, had a fine appearance, handsome features. And then the Lord said, let's go. I can use him. Now, this is what God said. He said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. You guys, this is a climax of the scene, right? So Samuel comes into the house of Jesse. All 7 of David's brothers, older brothers, mind you, are lined up, and the youngest comes in. Did you know that to be the youngest brother in this culture meant that you had nothing to look forward to? That's just the way it was. The firstborn received all the land, all the money, everything, and then it kind of trickled down from there. So David really didn't have much to look forward to. And I'm putting myself in this scene. David is just anointed by this powerful priest. So go ahead, put yourself there, right? You just got some olive oil dumped on your head. This is a very powerful moment in your life. You are now the king of Israel. You know, what would you do in that moment? Celebrate. So I picture shepherds, they have a staff, right? I would have looked at the older brother, the firstborn, and I would have been like, here you go, dude, go check the sheep. I'm the king now. What's up? Little bro's about to take over. You guys go check on the sheep. I'm gonna do king stuff. Like, what's next? Let's take over the world. So I'm thinking about King David, and I'm like, the Holy Spirit just empowered him. That's power, that's dynamite. To do what? To go tend the sheep. Imagine, David's 16 years old. You've just been anointed king. All right, go tend to your chores. Go check on the sheep. And this is so crazy to me, you guys. And this isn't like a fun job, right? I mean, ladies, you think sometimes your man comes home at night and he smells and you gotta lay next to him? Imagine David every single night laying next to these sheep. Like, they're not clean animals. They're dirty. They're gross. I truly believe that the word dingleberry was coined by shepherds. I'm serious. And if you don't know what that is, please do not Google it. Spare yourself. But if you haven't seen sheep, they're not pleasant animals. They're pretty stupid too. I think that's why God calls us sheep at times. So David lays with these sheep in the pasture. He protects these sheep. He loves these sheep. He sings songs to these sheep. He's faithful to what God has called him to. And that's why David lives a life of celebration, because he lives a life that is worth celebrating. He serves faithfully. He's obedient. So he goes back to the sheep. He's tending the sheep. Whatever God has in front of him, he's like, all right, I'm gonna do that. And all the while, remember, King Saul had the Lord's Spirit taken from him, but he still has the position of king. And what happened to Saul was he started to go crazy. He was so radically self-centered, living in fear because he's pursuing power, and he started to just go insane. He's this mad king now. And God sent an evil spirit to torment him. So King Saul is talking to his servants, and he's like, you guys have to find me some help. So in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 16, it says, let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre or the harp. He'll play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you'll feel better. So Saul said to his attendants, find someone who plays well and bring him to me. One of the servants answered, I've seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre or the harp. He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. And then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, this is what Saul said through a message, send me your son David who's with the sheep. Verse 21, David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Started thinking about this. I'm seeing a theme in David's life. Are you guys picking up on that theme? He now has more responsibilities, right? And to those who God can trust with a little, they are entrusted with more. I think that's somewhere in the Bible. So David is faithful, he's serving. And we see that a life worth celebrating is marked by service. Now he is an armor bearer. Now he's playing instruments for the king in order to bring him peace. And he still is faithful to tending the sheep. I love it. And this is where I think a lot of us get hung up on, is we get so consumed with trying to figure our life out, right? We're trying to figure out what God's will and his plans are for my life. And we act like it's some mysterious thing that's so far away and I can't grab it. And the Holy Spirit has empowered every single one of us to do amazing things. But you know where that starts? With serving. That's where it starts. Serving faithfully in your homes, among your families, serving faithfully in your job, serving faithfully at church. So many people will come up to me and they'll ask me, they're like, Nate, you seem like you have a pretty strong relationship with the Lord. Why don't I feel God's presence? How come I just don't even believe that he's there? And the first question that I ask them, I say, are you plugged in? Are you serving? Or are you too busy trying to figure your life out when you really need to be giving your life away? A life of celebration is a life worth celebrating, and a life worth celebrating is marked by service, giving yourself away. So now the story picks up in chapter 17. And we all know what happens in chapter 17. So now a war has broken out amongst the people of Israel. And now their arch nemesis of that time, the Philistines, have come to wage war. And the largest Philistine of them all, Goliath, comes out, right? And he's mocking the people of Israel and the God of Israel for 40 days. And this is so sad to me. King Saul, remember, he's pursuing power. He only cares really about himself. King Saul's not gonna risk his life and go fight Goliath. Not a chance. And this is so powerful for us to be reminded of as leaders. King Saul lived a life of fear, and that fear trickled down to every single person that was in that army. Everybody was afraid. It says they trembled. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 15. What's David up to? This is what David's doing. David's going back and forth from Saul to tending his father's sheep in Bethlehem. David is just faithfully serving. He's just jumping in the mix wherever he can. And so what happened was David's father, Jesse, he tells David, he says, hey, here's some cheese, here's some bread, here's some things that I want you to take to the commander of the army and go check on your brothers, see how they're doing. Because David had 3 older brothers that were enlisted in Saul's army. David was too young to enlist in the army. So 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 22. David brings these possessions and he leaves these things with the keeper of supplies. And he ran to the battle lines to find out how his brothers were doing. I love this. David wasn't trying to pursue fame. He wasn't trying to pursue power. He wasn't just trying to pursue success. What drove him to the front lines was his heart to serve and his compassion. So he runs to the front lines to check on his brothers. And his brothers are a little bitter. That baby brother was anointed king. So they're like, what are you doing here, man? Like, you're just trying to jump up in the mix and steal some more glory from us. And come on, like, we can't blame him, right? I'd be upset too. So David hears Goliath just mocking the people of Israel and mocking the people of God. And David can't stand it. So this is what David does in verse 32, 1 Samuel chapter 17. David says to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And we all know the story, right? David ends up slaying Goliath. But I don't want to just glide over this. It's really crazy for me to see that David's heart and his spirit is postured to make other people's problems his problem. And I think that's what God calls us to do. Actually, I know that's what God calls us to do. He calls us to stand in the gap. He calls us to build bridges of connection. He calls us to make other people's problems our problems. And even just thinking about this for a second, how many times have you been so guilty of being so busy with your life and with work, and you see somebody that is going through something or a problem arises right in front of you, and what's your natural response? It's not my problem, right? I'll be so busy at times, and this is so sad, but it's true, that I'm thinking about the next thing that I gotta do, and someone that I know, like I'm getting ready to walk by, I'm like, man, they're gonna take up a lot of my time right now. I've gotta get this done. All right, it's not my problem. And it's not what God calls me to do. It's not. He calls me to make other people's problems my problems. And this is the problem. I feel like many of us aren't living lives of celebration. what we're doing is we're living lives of desperation. And hear me out real quick. I think we're living lives of desperation and we can't celebrate because we're consumed by our problems. You want me to make other people's problems my problems? Do you know what I'm going through right now? Do you know what's on my plate? I can barely take care of myself right now. I feel like I'm drowning. I'm desperate. And we can't live a life of celebration because we're choosing to focus on ourselves and our problems. And I can't explain it. And I'm not limiting our problems. But when you live a life that is focused on the other and making other people's problems your problems, a miracle starts to happen. You start to experience the Spirit of God in your life. And even you guys, just go there with me. Have you ever had someone make your problem their problem? How has that felt? What has that done for you? It's crazy. Not my problem. No. And you know what this reminded me of, this teaching, as I'm thinking about it? You remember when we were kids and we had chores? I mean, if anybody was ever a kid, they know what I'm talking about. So that's everybody in this room. And you typically, there's a chore list. Or if you didn't have a list, you knew what was your job, right? What happened when your mom asked you to do something that wasn't on your list? What happened when your mom asked you to do your brother or sister's chore? Oh, I just saw your face, like, come on. What was your response? It's not my job. Mom, I'm doing my job. It's not my job. I already did my job. Seriously, it's ridiculous, right? And then what happens? We get another job because we talk back. I already did my job, right? And then we start throwing a fit and we're jumping up and down. It's not my job. And then what happens? Whack. No, I'm just kidding. It should have happened, but I'm just joking. I'm just joking. Careful. Social workers out there, I'm just kidding. Well, I'm not. So then I'm telling you guys, we never grow up. And we're living these lives of desperation and we can't stand our job because I go to work and who am I focused on? Myself. And then I'm walking around and I know there's stuff that I could be doing to help out, but I'm doing my job. It's not my job, right? I was prepping this message and somebody asked me to do something and I was like, that's not my... Oh, practice what you preach, Nate, before you preach it. I'm serious, you guys. I just ruined your lives for forever because you're going to be tempted to say it's not my job and you're going to be like, come on, God. So we end up going to work and we're concerned about power and success and climbing the corporate ladder, and I'm just focused on myself. And I just keep saying, it's not my job. And God calls us to be people that make other people's problems our problems. And I'm telling you, that act of kindness and service in the workplace, in your house, in your community, that can be your strongest witness. Service goes way beyond 9 to 5. And I was even thinking about this. Anytime I'm tempted to say it's not my job, this is the question that I ask myself. Can this advance the kingdom of God? If the answer is yes, then it's your job. Bottom line. So David is living this life that's just worthy of so much celebration because he's giving it away. He's serving others. And he kills this giant. And look what happens when he approaches King Saul, you guys. This blows my mind. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 57. It says, as soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David holding the Philistine's head. This is what Saul said. Whose son are you? The same son that you just requested to play the harp in your palace. You know who this is. But he doesn't. Because King Saul's focused only on himself. He doesn't even remember who David is. He's using David. And I'm telling you guys, the quickest way to live a miserable life is to focus on yourself. It's self-service, right? And when we think the universe revolves around us, it ends up driving us insane. And that's exactly what happened to King Saul. Exactly. So fast forward, flyover view, King Saul can't stand the favor that David has on his life. And I think because King Saul was afraid of David. King Saul couldn't serve David. And so Saul ends up throwing spears at David, trying to kill David. And then what happens is David is running for his life for the next 16 years. A lot of people would be tempted to say, man, those are some wasted years. David is the anointed king of Israel, but he doesn't yet have the position of king. So he's running for his life, and King Saul is trying to kill him with everything he's got. And you know what David's response is throughout that whole time? He never once criticizes Saul. He never once speaks ill of Saul. Like, read through the story on your own time. It's mind-blowing. He says, hey, God brought him into that position. It's the Lord that's gonna take him out, not me. Wow. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. You guys can turn there. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. So what happened is David's spending his entire life on the run. He's gathered some men, he's on the run, and I've been to this location that he ends up. It's called En-Gedi, and it's near the Dead Sea, barren desert, and it's this oasis called En-Gedi. It's beautiful, and David is hiding in a cave. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1, it says, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistine, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. I love that David's still hanging out with the sheep. And a cave was there. And Saul went in to relieve himself, and David and his men were far back in that same cave. The men said, David, this is it. This is your opportunity. This is the day that you've been waiting for. The Lord said he'd give your enemies into your hands. Take care of him. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 4, it says, then David crept up unnoticed. Now just stop there. We're talking 3,000 years ago. This isn't 2017, right? If I'm alive 3,000 years ago and I've got a sword in my hand and this guy who's been trying to kill me his entire life is right here relieving himself. I don't want to go there, don't know what that means. But he's been gossiping about me, talking smack about me, and I'm walking up on him. I'll tell you what I do. I get in my power stance with my sword, right? Cody Bellinger swing. And King David blows me away, you guys. You know what he does? He cuts off a hem of his robe, just a piece of his robe. And then even after he does that, he starts freaking out. How can I bring such honor and shame onto the king? Read it in verse 25, I think it is. No, it's verse 5. Chapter 24, verse 5. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. And this blows me away. But again, it really doesn't, because David is living a life worth celebrating. And a life worth celebrating is a life of sacrifice. So David just metaphorically fell on his own sword, right? David sacrificed his own ego, his own heart in that moment, and spared Saul. Everybody around him said, David, you have every right to take this guy out. And David chose to sacrifice. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 10, it says, this day you have seen with your own eyes, David's talking to Saul, how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I won't lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. David lived a life of celebration because he lived a life of sacrifice. You guys, think about this. Put yourself in his shoes. I picture David hiding in the caves. Some of his psalms came from this experience. And I picture him saying, really, God? This is what you anointed me for so that I could be on the run for 16 years of my life. I would give anything to go back to those pastures. I would give anything to go back with those sheep and to be laying in that grass and staring at the stars and singing songs about you. And then I see this resolve coming over him and him saying, I've sacrificed too much. I've come too far. God took this young boy from the pastures and eventually brought him to the palace. And those years were not wasted. Those years of sacrifice made him the man that he became. And so I was thinking about sacrifice, and I'm like, there is no celebration without sacrifice. Think about it. Think about anything in your life that you've celebrated. What did it cost you? And the bigger the sacrifice, usually the greater the celebration, right? And the reason why I feel like some of us aren't living lives of celebration because we're not sacrificing. We're not giving our lives away. We're not dying to ourselves. And honestly, you could even be hearing this message and be like, Nate, that sounds great, but how am I supposed to live this kind of life? How in the world am I supposed to live a life of celebration if this is what it looks like? And I'll show you how. So up on stage, I have some balloons. And you want to talk about celebration, right? Austin, can you come up here real quick? I was thinking about balloons, and I'm thinking about the practice of celebration. And I'm thinking about how, who doesn't love balloons, right? When you walk into the room and you see balloons, what? Parents don't love balloons. When you walk into a room and you see balloons, it's go time. And I'm thinking that's the kind of life that we should be living, right? When people walk into a room and see us, they can celebrate. I don't want to be the kind of person when I leave, that's when people celebrate, right? You don't want to be that guy. And so I'm thinking about how our lives are like these balloons. And what's this balloon full of right now? Hot air, thank you. And I feel like one of the reasons why we can't live this kind of life, if I can just be honest, because a lot of us are full of a bunch of hot air. When we live a life that's focused on ourselves, that's what it looks like. When some difficult person comes into our life and we're focused only on ourselves, I call these people EGR, extra grace required, right? So when they come into your life and you're like, all right, God, give me an extra dose. Like, I know I'm gonna need it. If you're full of a bunch of hot air, what's gonna happen when those people come into your life? And this is the EGR people right here, this flame. When trials come into your life, when tribulation comes into your life, what's gonna happen? When you throw a pity party about your boss, when you criticize people, when you talk more about your problems rather than how you can be a solution, you know what you're doing? This is your life. What happens? Every single time. Every single time. Party's over, right? That's why we can't celebrate. But did you know that Jesus calls himself the living water? And this is so corny, but it's so true. What are you drinking deep from in your life? Is it Fox or CNN or Instagram or Facebook? Are you filling yourself with just a bunch of hot air? Because I tell you what, when you drink deep from the well of life, and those hard people come in, trials hit you, work's just sucking right now, not my problem, this is you right here. You know what Jesus does? The same spirit that raised him from the grave lives inside us. That's what my Bible tells me. And I believe the only way that we can live this kind of life, a life that is characterized by celebration, is if we drink deep from the well of living water. Check this out. Let's put this over this like $6,000 pedal board right here. I'm just kidding, guys. I'm just joking back there. Watch this, okay? Hold it up high for them. I'm full of the living water, right? Come on, EGR, bring it. Trials, bring it. Look at that. Look at that. I'm not a magician. I'm seriously not. That's what happens when we drink deep from the well, when we're filled up with his spirit. a life of celebration, in order to live a life, I butchered my own quote, look at that. In order to live a life of celebration, we must live lives worth celebrating. And a life worth celebrating is a life that's given away, that's focused on the other, that sacrifices every single day. I mean, even just thinking about it, the ultimate sacrifice, come on, the cross. Without that sacrifice, we have no reason to celebrate. And honestly, that gives me reason alone to be able to get up and thank God for every single day that he's given me. And if I can be really transparent, you guys, this has been one of the hardest weeks of prepping a message that I've ever had. I started to get really self-conscious, and I'm like, man, Lord, how am I preaching on celebration when we need to be talking about grief and suffering? And that's next weekend, by the way. Seriously. But I was thinking about that, and I'm like, man, God's Spirit spoke to me, and I felt this thought impressing on me, and it said, now more than ever, we need to be people that live lives that are worth celebrating. Seriously. Now more than ever, we need to be people that serve sacrificially among our families, among our churches, in our workplace. Now more than ever, it's your problem. Now more than ever, it's your job. And I'm just thinking about that. I'm like, man, Lord, use us. We need you. And so what I wanted to do, I just wanted everybody to stand with me. If you believe that you can live this kind of life, not on your own strength, but that it is possible, I want you to stand with me. And I'm gonna pray for God's Spirit to dwell richly inside of us so that we can make a difference in this world. Because now more than ever, we need to live lives that are worth celebrating.